Hello, Miami alumni and friends. I am JJ Slager with the Alumni Association, and I'm very excited to be joined today by Dr. Curt Ellison for a special presentation, Crossroads of Conflict, Oxford, Ohio, and the American Civil War. This is the second presentation of Winter College, which is a week of bringing some of Miami to you online. We hope you'll consider joining us each day at noon this week. Also, if you missed last night's sparkling wine tasting with Jack Keegan, you can still watch the recording of that. And the next event is tomorrow at noon, Faded Glory, Ethics and Politics of International and Sport Mega Events. You can sign up for all of the Winter College events on this webinar site, alumlc.org/MiamiOH. So, Curt, thank you again for joining us. Dr. Curt Ellison is Professor Emeritus of History and American Studies from Miami, and he's also was the editor of the Miami University Bicentennial Perspectives history book. And so we are very excited to have him join us today. And I just want to let the viewers know out there that we will take live questions at the end. So please share those as we go along by clicking the Ask a Question button right below your video. And so without further ado, I will turn it over to you, Curt. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you, JJ, and thanks to all of you who have tuned in today for another excursion into Miami history. I want to give a special note to Valerie Elliott from the Smith Library of Regional History, Robert Schmidt from the archivist at Miami, and Bob Wicks from the Art Museum for substantial work that helped put this presentation, helped me put this presentation together by finding all sorts of wonderful things. And of course, any historical account stands on previous written histories. Dr. Upham wrote the first history of Miami in 1909 and was followed by works by Haverhurst, Schreiber, Valerie Elliott's work on Oxford, Jackie Johnson in 2014. And of course, all of that influenced the commitment to connect Miami history to local history in the Bicentennial History book published in 2009, which I had the honor to edit. And today we're going to talk about a topic that's mentioned in that book, but we're going to expand a bit on it. And it deals with Miami's experience during the War of the Rebellion between 1861 and 66. We know that Civil War was felt not only as a clash of armies on distant battlefields, but like all eras of political and social conflict, as increasing dispute led up to warfare, the wartime experience and the memories of the war played out in the daily lives of people in every local community. And the borderlands college town of Oxford was certainly no exception. We were near a slave-holding state, and this community bore ample witness to conflicting loyalties. And today, we're going to look at that civic drama and how it has been remembered. So I titled my topic, Crossroads of Conflict, Oxford, Ohio, and the American Civil War Era, the home front and historical memory in a borderlands college town. We're going to look at three broad themes: political instability and student unrest in Old Miami in the years running up to the Civil War, the historical actors in Oxford during the Civil War era, and then how that war has been remembered. This is a short cast of main characters that you will see in the images that follow. George Junkin and Robert McFarland were Miami faculty and both presidents of the university who had many wartime involvements. Osro Dodds and John Minor Milliken were Miami students who played significant roles in the war itself. Virginia Moon lived in Oxford and had been a student at Oxford Female College, and you'll hear much more about her. And Peter Bruner, a resident of Oxford after the war, will also appear here in an important way. So part one, Old Miami, creating a town of colleges. This allows us to see some context for what happened during white settlement of the West. We know that the Miami people occupied this land prior to the coming of white settlement after the American Revolution, and this map, which was put together by the Miami Project and the Miami Tribe, gives us a visual indication of where those lands were. They later became the states of Ohio, Indiana, Wisconsin, Illinois, and Michigan, at least in part of those states. And in the upper left, we have an image of Anthony Wayne, who on behalf of General Washington, or President Washington, led an army that finally repressed the Native American resistance to the coming of white people to this region. Little Turtle was a major figure, and he signed the Treaty of Greenville, August 3rd, 1795. Chief Bruet was a later Miami chief. Today, Miami University has a land acknowledgement, and it says Miami is located within the traditional homelands of the Miami and Shawnee people, who, along with other indigenous groups, ceded these lands to the United States in the first Treaty of Greenville in 1795. Miami people, whose name our university carries, were forcibly removed from these homelands in 1846. That's a story that I hope you will learn more about. But today we're going to look at what happened when white people came in after Indians were no longer forcibly resisting settlement. The Northwest Ordinance of 1787 provided terms by which this land would be settled by white people coming in from the East Coast and other places. One of the ways would be to provide a congressional grant to an individual who would then resell the land for settlement. And John Cleve Sims from New Jersey acquired the Sims Purchase between the Miami Rivers in southwestern Ohio in 1794. And one of the conditions for these kinds of purchases, for this purchase, was that one of the townships that would be laid out, and it had to be set aside where tax would be perpetually collected to fund education. And so here's an image of Oxford as a community that was laid out in 1810, the year after Miami was chartered in 1809. Classes would not begin until 1824. If we look at the old Miami campus in these early images from the 1830s and the 1850s, and on the bottom right, the earliest known photograph of the institution, all of them indicate that it was a small place. It was out in the woods, only accessible by two-lane roads because of political squabble about the location of the university and the township, and other factors caused the legislature to say, okay, let's put it where there are no towns. So suddenly we had a small college that was going to be a residential place and small, and a place where people would have a great deal of proximity to one another 24 hours a day. Even after or near the end of the old Miami era, the campus was essentially three buildings. Old Main in the center was where classes were held and chapel was held and other activities. And the two buildings just to the left were North and South Hall, which were built as residence or dormitories for students. What was going on here? Well, college life was treated as mental discipline. Here's a recruiting flyer from 1825. Robert Hamilton Bishop, our first president, talked here about how the university, what the university expected to do with students. And you can see in these statements on the left, for the sophomore class, in addition to knowing all about 2 books of the Aeneid and as much Greek as necessary to read the Greek Testament, they'll be studying arithmetic, geography, algebra, the whole of Virgil and Sallust, and some portions of Horace and Cicero. The second year will comprehend also English and Latin grammar, geography, arithmetic, measuring, surveying, rhetoric, composition, moral and philosophy, political economy, ancient and modern history. So they had a very strict notion of a classical education being something that would impart knowledge to young men, and they intended for them to learn it. Beyond that, the larger intention was to create gentlemen. These deportment laws of 1843 show you that that students are to consider themselves as young gentlemen associated for the purpose of improvement. They shall attend biblical recitation each Sabbath. They're to treat the president, professors, and other instructors on all occasions with profound respect. They're not allowed to hold any meetings without, among themselves, without permission of the faculty or the president, and not wear any pistols, dirks, stilettos, or other dangerous weapons. Even the public face of Miami at this time, which is probably best seen in this school textbook written by William Holmes McGuffey as a series of eclectic readers, and used all across the country as one of the most popular textbooks ever written, and certainly the most well-read of any book that has ever come out of Miami. But if you look at lesson 1 of the first reader, John, Ann, and Jane. Ann has a new book. It's the first book. She must keep it nice and clean. And lesson 14, which is about a lame man who has become ill and needs assistance, and we need to help him. But now look at that sick boy over there. He's not sick for want of food. He had a cake sent to him, and he was told not to eat too much of it, yet he did. So even in popular culture, Miami had an image of being a pretty strict and prescriptive place. So what was college life like beyond the classroom? Well, the first thing it was an opportunity for more spiritual discipline. The state of Ohio had created the campus, but turned it over to the Presbyterian Church to operate. And so at various times, there were up to 4 or 5 Presbyterian congregations in Oxford and a theological seminary during the old Miami era. There were other religious institutions here as well, among them the 3 pictured in the lower right, the Methodist Episcopal Church, the African and Methodist Episcopal Church lower left, and even a Universalist church. But the Presbyterians were in charge, and they held sway. What could students do other than take their classes and involve themselves in religious studies? Well, they could debate one another. The classical curriculum proceeded through a protocol of having students recite their lessons in class. And so recitation occurred in the classroom, but in 2 different literary halls that were in the old main. Students could hold debates about topics of interest to them. So let's look at some of the things they discussed. There were 2 societies, the Aradelphian and the Union. In the 1830s, the Aradelphian was talking about such things as what profession is best for oratorical skills, the bar or the pulpit. Many Miami students were headed toward the legal profession or the ministry. Not all, but many. And they asked, and you can see that in the 1830s, the women's movement had caught their attention as well. Should they confine themselves to the domestic sphere? 30 years later, the focus was on the slavery question and what would be happening with new territories coming into the Union from the West. in March of 1860, would dissolution of the Union be preferable to the admission of another slave state? No. But in June, despite the Supreme Court deciding in Dred Scott that slave owners could take their enslaved persons into non-slave states, should Congress be able to stop that by regulating slavery? And the answer was yes. And the Union Society, in April of 1861, the year that Civil War hostilities broke out, had a lengthy discussion about, is the argument for secession valid? And the answer was no. But some members, it was noted, were fined for disorder. About 30% of Miami students at this time were from southern states. That does not mean they all came from slaveholding families, but some no doubt did. Let's talk a moment about Oxford town life. So what's going on around this growing debate on the Miami campus? Well, how do you get here in the old Miami age? The railroad didn't come until 1859. It's in the upper left. Of course, we had canals much earlier than that came through Hamilton. The primary means of getting here was either riding by horseback, some people walked, or coming through up the river on a steamboat to Cincinnati and then taking the stage up one of the turnpikes to Oxford. By 1865, there was a thriving Civil War era village here. It had two views. These are photographs of the West Park looking north in 1865. And on the south side, Main and High Streets, there's a large hotel. And indeed, there was more than one lodging place in Oxford, the Cone House, the Oxford Hotel. The Junction Railroad built its own hotel in 1859 near the railroad station, and some homes in Oxford of prominent citizens were well known for hosting visitors. So we can say that travelers were coming to Oxford as a college town, and they brought some ideas with them. And let's pause for a minute to ask what was going on by the run-up to the 1850s. Well, democratic revolutions were sweeping across Europe. There was a gold rush just beginning in California, but there was a lot of activity about the admission of new states to the Union. Wisconsin came in as a free state in 1848. The Oregon Territory was established, and the Mexican War, which was coming to a close, was promising up to 8 new states would be added. Oh, and up at Seneca Falls in New York, women were convening to advocate for more women's rights. On campus, the Miami literary societies were locked in a bare-knuckle struggle with the administration over who could approve speakers who would come from outside to speak before the literary societies. And in January 1848, we have a student rebellion. President Junkin, who had been president in the 1840s, had issued the rules for deportment you saw earlier. His successor, McMaster, was a strict disciplinarian. These are all conservative Presbyterian ministers as well as presidents. They both lived in a house that ironically today is a fraternity house at East High Street. And they were opponents of the coming of secret fraternities, which were imported from Union College to Miami as early as 1833. They didn't have that house then and may not have had that crest, but Alpha Delta Pi was on campus and they were banished. Or that is to say, they were not sanctioned. And so let's look at the events of 1848. Down at the bottom, you'll see a mural that hung in the Heritage Room at the Shriver Center for many years called A Biography of a University. And it has a very important section showing a sort of Currier and Ives style image of young men rolling up snowballs as if it were a winter frolic. They filled up the lobby of Old Main with snow after a big snowstorm. The president, who had been at home in bed with the cold, came out, that would be McMaster, and he vowed to expel them all. In response to which the students added more snow, the college woodpile and furniture, and nailed shut the windows and doors, and it took 3 days to reopen the building because there was a hard freeze. Well, when things thawed out, the president held hearings and expelled 46 of the students. As they were ousted, they went outside to a bonfire, formed a march through town with a small brass band, and half the senior class departed. Some went off to Centre College in Kentucky. Well, that was January of 1848. In fall of 1849, the enrollment dropped from 112 to 69 students, and the board fired the president. So we have a little compromise of 1849, which parallels larger ones that are going on over the slavery issue around the country. In Miami's case, it came with the arrival of William C. Anderson, who was yet another Presbyterian minister, as all presidents had been, but he was a more tolerant and easygoing one. He brought his son with him, and together they joined the Phi Delta Theta fraternity in 1849. It had come to Miami in 1848 as a secret society, and 2 other fraternities were founded here in 1839 and 1855. And suddenly, college life outside the classroom, where students could organize their own behavior and have authority over what they did, was a sanctioned part of Miami University. And today, the fraternity tradition at Miami remembers Miami as the place where the Miami Triad was founded, making it the mother of fraternities. There were women in this town of colleges as well. Miss Bennett had a school for girls in 1830, the Oxford Female Institute in the 1840s, the Oxford Female College in the 1850s were all created here to educate young women in the West, and the Western Female Seminary, 1855, the longest lived and most successful of them, was created by people who came out from Mount Holyoke Seminary, sponsored by the Third Presbyterian Church. They had a quite substantial campus by the end of the Civil War era. If we look at this chart, this is a chart of enrollment of women and men in the town of Oxford at all institutions from 1824, when Miami opened, up until about 2005. But I direct your attention to the left side, where we're speaking about the old Miami era. Women are in a red line here and men in a blue. And notice that throughout the old Miami era, there were actually, for the most part, more women enrolled in higher education in Oxford, the town of colleges, than there were men. And although Miami ceased operation for 12 years after the financial panic of 1872, the women's colleges never closed. So you might expect someone like Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who was related to the last president of old Miami by marriage, to come to Miami to speak, and so she did. The Miami Student reported her talk as saying, "The night of women's bondage is far spent, and the light of franchise, the right to vote for women, is fast breaking." Well, not quite so fast. It took another 50 years, but then we had another conflict that came right away, and that was the Civil War. And we're going to look first at a few historical actors in Oxford's Civil War era. They were of many different opinions: colonizationists, abolitionists, African Americans, Union partisans, and Confederate sympathizers. Colonizationists believed that slavery was wrong, should be eliminated, but they could not imagine the integration of African Americans into white society. And so An early resistance to slavery in the 1820s up through the 1840s was the idea that slaves should be freed, but then removed from white society, perhaps taken back to Africa. And many prominent Miamians were sympathetic to this view. Jeremiah Morrow, who was with the Board of Trustees and governor of Ohio, was president of the State Colonization Society. Robert Hamilton Bishop, the first president, had some sympathies that way, as did McGuffey, John W. Scott, who had helped founded one of the women's schools, and George Junkin. But we also had abolitionists come around Miami. And let's begin again with Robert Hamilton Bishop, who changed his views and became much more oriented toward abolition as the sentiment for it grew in the 1840s and 1840s. And so he shifted his opinion, and some say that had a role in his departure from Miami. James G. Birney was a prominent abolitionist who published a newspaper in Cincinnati. He sent his two sons to Miami. William Birney later became a major general in the United States Army. Lyman Beecher, he was a Presbyterian minister at the Lane Theological Seminary, which had some ties to Miami because some students could finish their work here and go on to seminary there. But he came to campus to speak several times against slavery. And, his daughter, Harriet Beecher Stowe, wrote a book that had a significant role in the Civil War, according to President Lincoln. Thomas E. Thomas, a Miami student, founded an anti-slavery society for students as early as 1834. Well, the Underground Railroad helped slaves escape their enslavement. It wasn't underground, it wasn't a railroad, but it was a network of people who assisted runaway slaves. And you can see at the top two depictions of major routes of the Underground Railroad, and you can see that one runs right through Ohio, comes up the rivers and runs through Cincinnati, and the indication at the bottom shows you that some established routes came through Oxford. This home in Oxford, built in 1829 approximately, belonged to Ebenezer Lane, whose family was associated with the Lane Theological Seminary, where Beecher held forth. And so it may be that it was an Underground Railroad site. It was out to the east of town. Lewis Place, today's president's home, was the home of Jane North Lewis, a widow who is listed in some accounts of Underground Railroad agents as a sympathizer and a supporter. So that's possible. Most probable was the John Jones house that just south of Oxford. It burned in 1974. But Jones was an African-American who lived there and a documented conductor on the Underground Railroad. And that's probably the most active site. His son fought in the war. Well, let's look at population growth here. Butler County, Hamilton, the county seat, which is 12 miles from Oxford, and then Oxford, between the census of 1850 and the census of 1860, both of which enumerated both Black and white residents, we can see that Butler County grew in absolute numbers of African Americans in that decade, but only by 2.1% relative to the total population. Hamilton also grew slightly in numbers, but declined relative to the total population in its number of Black residents. In Oxford, the number of Black residents went up per capita by about 2%, and there were it almost doubled their numbers in that decade. And by 1860, one calculation has it that about 22% of the African Americans living in Butler County lived in Oxford. So you would expect from this black settlement some political activism, and that occurred. In the lower right corner, you see an image of Elijah East and Jane Bedenbaugh, who settled in Oxford Township in 1826. To the left is Hiram Revels. He was a minister at the Bethel AME African Methodist Episcopal Church. He would later be the first African American to serve in Congress, as he represented Mississippi in the Senate after 1870. He was a minister here at one time, and there was a Butler County Black Convention, and it was held in Oxford in January of 1853. And after much deliberation, they agreed that slavery is a sin against God and a crime against man. That's been studied by Professor Fahey of the history department. And a recent discovery I learned about a few days ago is that Western students recorded in their journal that Frederick Douglass spoke in this town because they said they wanted to hear this renowned and eloquent speaker. So we went to hear Fred Douglass talk. Douglass, of course, was one of the most prominent outspoken abolitionists in the country, and a friend and advisor to Abraham Lincoln. And so war came in 1861 in April, when the state of South Carolina attacked Fort Sumter. And right away, Lincoln called for volunteers for the Union Army to put down the rebellion. And right away, Oxford produced them. This is Charles Barrows, who had been a Miami student. He was an Oxford artist in 1861. One of his well-known paintings, which hangs today in McGuffey Museum, is in the upper right-hand corner. He joined up and became an illustrator for General Rosecrans. These are two of his illustrations that appeared also in Harper's Weekly. He would die of typhoid at Murfreesboro near the Battle of Stones River in 1863. There were two companies raised in Oxford right away. The Company A, 86th Regiment, had 104 volunteers, 66 of them students. Osro Dodds raised Company B, which was called the University Rifles, and that's Osro Dodds in the center. And these are the sign-up sheets for the University Rifles, which are in our archival collections. And I'll direct your attention to the insert at the bottom. The first to sign was Osro Dodds. They all signed very strongly, but I particularly like Mr. C.H. Murray on the right, who not only wrote his name boldly, but he underlined it, and he drew in the margins a picture of those weapons he was not supposed to own. The faculty got the war fever too, at least some of them did. This is Robert McFarland, who was professor of mathematics and astronomy, would later become president of New Miami. But during the war, he served as a colonel in the 86th OVI, and he was on campus and intermittently, and then he would go back to serve in the war and serve throughout Kentucky in this region. But he had quite a case of the war fever, according to documentation that we have today. In 1860, the Miami faculty had commended him with this motion that said, on the motion of Professor Swing, we'll hear from him again later, McFarland was declared a magnificent officer, and they set about a committee to give him a gold-tipped cane. McFarland didn't think too well of John W. Hall, who was president of Miami University, and ironically, a Presbyterian minister who had come here from Huntsville, Alabama. So he was a Southerner. As president of Miami University during the War of the Rebellion, and he was under constant suspicion. McFarland kept a day book. And on this day, April 11th, 1861, the day prior to the attack on Fort Sumter, he wrote in it, "Today was mostly clear and very pleasant." He always began with the weather. And then he said, at a faculty confab, I noticed Dr. H's, that would be Hall, ill-concealed dislike of the North and opposite of South. withering rebuke by Professor B. That's probably Robert Hamilton Bishop Jr. And then H. Hall had said, our army, meaning secesh. Well, McFarland encountered students who had opinions that were not consistent with his, and he got into what may have been a fistfight uptown at one point in 1862. And this documentation from the student's father is a complaint about his behavior. There's several items of correspondence about this. He had Professor McFarland sued for assault and prosecuted for assault and battery in Hamilton Mayor's Court, and McFarland pled guilty. David Loudenbeck wrote that he held the utmost contempt for McFarland's overbearing and tyrannical treatment of students who hold political opinions antagonistic to his own and believe him unfit to occupy the position of professor in any college. We're not sure what the student said, but we think he uttered a biblical defense of slavery. That is, slaves should obey their masters and all this disruption is out of order. McFarland had allies, though. Trustee John M. Milliken from Hamilton sent letters on more than one occasion to McFarland during the war, asking him to watch out for people who were sympathetic to the South, giving secession speeches at university gatherings or holding some traitorous proceedings. In fact, he concluded this strictly confidential letter from 1863 by saying, as there are said to be spies about Oxford, you had better destroy this upon perusal. Fortunately, he did not. It's in our archives. There might have been reason to write such a letter because there were Confederate sympathizers documented in Oxford. This is the Moon sisters, Charlotte and Lottie Moon and Virginia Moon, and their house on High Street in Oxford, right next to Jane North Lewis' home. They were sympathetic to the Confederacy. They had their father had freed his slaves in Virginia and relocated to Oxford, Ohio, when Charlotte was young, and Virginia Moon was born here. There's a later story that sort of romanticizes Charlotte Lottie Moon, and it says that she was engaged to Ambrose E. Burnside, who was from a nearby community in Indiana and would later become a U.S. Army general in the Civil War. But she left him standing at the altar and then was attracted to Judge James Clark of what today would be Fairfield, Ohio. Judge James Clark was the head of Confederate sympathizers in this region, or was one leader of them, that were known as Copperheads. Well, she married him, and it's said that Judge Clark showed, as they stood at the altar, opened his coat to show a revolver and said, "There'll be a wedding today or a funeral tomorrow." Whatever that be the case, there is indication that Virginia Moon, her sister, was a courier for the cause of the Confederacy, and we'll hear a little bit more about that. Vallandigham was a politician in Dayton who headed the Southern sentiment in this region, and John Hunt Morgan was a Confederate raider general who came through this region, and they were supposed to be giving aid and comfort to that movement. Well, we don't know how true all of that is, but we do know that we have in our archives a wartime note to Virginia Moon from the President of the Confederacy, Jefferson Davis, which ends, "God help you, and my dear friend, your dear sister, is the fervent prayer of Jefferson Davis." Virginia Moon was also detained in Cincinnati in April of 1863. She had a valise that was carrying morphine, opium, and camphor, that is medical supplies, and letters from Confederate prisoners imprisoned in Columbus that she was taking across the lines to Southerners. She was later sent to prison for a short time. And today, in Butler County, this Copperhead movement has been remembered. In 2007, the Historical Society down in Shandon, Ross Township, put up a marker to what was called the Butler County Mutual Protection Company of people from Indiana and Southern Ohio who formed a protest to the draft and the president's handling of the war at a township house in Shandon, Ohio, just south of Oxford. So that takes us to, how do we remember all of these things that were happening during the Civil War these days in Southwestern Ohio? Well, like the events themselves, we remember them in many different ways. As freedom, as a lost cause, as a moment of divided families, or gallant men, a brother's war, romantic Cavalry, noble sacrifice, or a silent vigil. Freedom. Peter Bruner. Peter Bruner was an enslaved person in Kentucky who escaped his enslavement, joined the United States Colored Heavy Artillery, 12th Regiment, fought in the war, relocated to Oxford, or located to Oxford after the Civil War, and became a very visible figure in this small town. He worked for the women's colleges and for Miami. One Miami president gave him the top hat you see him wearing here, which you can see today at the McGuffey Museum. He learned to read and write, and with the help of his daughter, he published A Slave's Adventures Toward Freedom, not fiction, but the true story of a struggle. So we had a slave narrative published right here in Oxford, and this gentleman became honorary mayor for a day in 1938. The United States Colored Infantry grave markers are oh, here we go. Sorry. As a point of memory, 179,000 Black soldiers served in the U.S. Army during the War of the Rebellion, and 19,000 served in the United States Navy. And some of them are buried in Oxford at Woodside Cemetery. In September 2013, this cemetery is on Chestnut Street, for those of you who would like to locate it in your memory of Oxford. A memorial was put up to the old John Brown post of the Grand Army of the Republic, and these are some of the burial sites at this cemetery that mark U.S. colored infantry soldiers. Another way the war has been remembered in Oxford is the lost cause. Albert Taylor Bledsoe was actually a faculty member at Miami University for a short time prior to the Civil War. He left here and eventually ended up at the University of Virginia and became Assistant Secretary of War in the Confederate Cabinet during the wartime. As early as 1856, he published an essay defending the South, but after the war, a book called Is Davis a Traitor, or Was Secession a Constitutional Right? That came out in 1866. So he was an early lost cause historian, and there were later ones, but that group argued, the war was not about slavery because slaves lived in happy families. The conflict really should be called a war between states. And the South lost, even though they fought nobly, because they were overwhelmed by material resources. Now, that view has been confounded by many later historians who said, well, the Confederate secession ordinances of the states all said it was about slavery. Plantations should be regarded as enslaved labor farms. And at the time, it was called the War of the Rebellion, and the South actually lost the war on the battlefields. But this more benign view of war permeated American thought especially after the turn of the early 20th century. And in Oxford, the Confederate spies were romanticized and celebrated for quite a long time. This publication in 1962 by Ms. Ophia Smith about the spy wed at Pistol Point talks about her daring character. And her house was given to the university in 1987 and had a sign out front and naming it as the Lottie Moon House for a long time. That sign has been removed. But Lottie Moon Clark, born in Danville, Virginia, died in Philadelphia and was buried in West Philadelphia. After the war, she became a writer. She published romantic novels and she wrote poetry. The past dies as it wakes to the present. And her home in Fairfield with Judge James Clark was demolished. Her sister, however, Virginia B. Moon, was clearly an unreconstructed Confederate for her entire lifetime. She went out west to California and had bit parts in movies. She appeared in public, and whenever she appeared in public, she flew the Confederate national flag and the battle flag of the Army of Northern Virginia. And she was unreconstructed right down to the time she died. She died in Greenwich Village in New York City, but by her wishes, she was buried in Memphis, Tennessee. But, before she died, she was reported to have been the first woman to ride in a seaplane. The Civil War produced divided families, and Oxford was no exception. And here we have another legacy of Professor George Junkin. You recall he was the president who had been in charge of old Miami rules and regulations. He left Miami and ended up at Washington College in Lexington, Virginia, later became Washington and Lee University. He had two daughters. On the left is Margaret Junkin Preston, who married a Confederate officer and lived in Richmond, Virginia for the duration of the war. In 2007, a book about her poetry called her the Poet of the Confederacy. His other daughter, Eleanor Junkin, married Stonewall Jackson, Thomas J. Stonewall Jackson, a Confederate general whose life story was told in a 2003 movie that lasts 5 hours. Junkin was estranged from his own sister, who was a strong abolitionist and supporter of the West Virginia Cavalry. And in the movie, there's said to be a touching scene where the Junkin family divides because President Junkin, who had before the war attacked abolitionism as something disruptive of the Union, at the time of the disunion, he opposed Southern secession and moved back to Philadelphia. So the family was split in several ways, as was characteristic of many families in this time. Well, there were gallant men, we are told, and not all of them were on the battlefield. Ellie Gring was a schoolmaster in Oxford, Ohio, who in 1908 published this tribute to the wartime governors of Illinois, Indiana, and Ohio, all of whom were Miami graduates or students. It was said to be a brothers' war. So again, in the biography of a university, the Heritage Room mural, we have a depiction of soldiers marching off to war from the Miami campus clad in their uniforms. That never happened. But they did leave, and they did go in different directions at that time. And some of them met again because this account, which appeared in Grennan's book, but has also appeared elsewhere and has been studied recently again, is about the death of Joel Battle, who fought for the Tennessee Infantry for the Confederacy. He was found dead on the battlefield at Shiloh by two of his classmates from the Miami class of 1859, John Lewis and John Chamberlain, who supposedly removed him gently for a proper burial. So brothers from Miami fought one another at Shiloh. The cavalry, of course, was remembered as romantic. Here's Osro Dodds again. Osro Dodds was the first person to sign up from Miami students, as you recall, and served with them for some time. Later, he was assigned to the 1st Alabama Cavalry of the United States Volunteers. If you're unaware of it, there were many Southerners who volunteered for service in the United States Army. And it's interesting to me that Osro Dodds was made Lieutenant Colonel of the 1st Alabama Cavalry, which was put at the lead of the columns that went into Atlanta. So if you have seen Gone with the Wind or any other depictions of the burning of Atlanta, it was people from North Alabama with Osro Dodds who entered that city first. In 2005, the city of Glendale, not far from here, celebrated Morgan's Great Raid. He was a Confederate raider who came through this region. They did not mention, maybe they didn't know, and maybe it's not thoroughly documented, but some accounts have it that Professor McFarland was involved at some point in the pursuit of John Hunt Morgan, who was captured over in southeastern Ohio and put in the Ohio State Penitentiary, from which he escaped only to be killed later in battle. Noble sacrifice. Well, we have cemeteries around this region, and we're going to begin with the Woodside Cemetery in Middletown, Ohio. This section you see in the lower right is the Civil War section. That monument was to soldiers who died in the Union cause in the Civil War. And when it was dedicated in 1897 by Congressman Paul Sorg, he had a good deal to say about the cannon that he acquired to guard the memorial and burial sites of these noble people. He says the cannon no longer raise their horrid voice for the Union and freedom. No longer do they wear the black scowl of rage. Their grimy faces thrill the soldiers with assurance of victory. But on the part of the government, I place these in your charge. Let not your thoughts run to the widows and orphans they made. Don't think of the lovers' hearts they have torn and tried. Don't think of the mothers they robbed, or the wife whose prayer that the father of her children be returned was not answered. Think of them as the cause of the glorious Union and the freedom we now enjoy. And here is John Minor Milliken, who had been a Miami student. He was living in Hamilton when he volunteered for the 1st Ohio Cavalry. He was killed at Stones River, but he was memorialized in Oxford by the Reverend David Swing, who was a Miami professor and minister of the Third Presbyterian Church. And this is what he said about the death of Minor Milliken. Christ died for the greater good of humanity. Milliken gave his life so that his nation might live. We can never come to a rest so sweet unless we approach it by the path he trod, the path of sacrifice. And finally, we have today mostly a silent vigil. Andrew Johnson declared the war over in 1866 when he said order, tranquility, and civil authority have been restored. We're still restoring the battle flag of the 35th OVI at our local historical society in Butler County. These slogans are on the Soldiers, Sailors, and Pioneers Monument in Hamilton, a major memorial in the center of that town. Notice the slogans: one country, one flag. From Lincoln, malice toward none and charity for all. But over on the right, eternal vigilance is the price of liberty, and the penalty of treason is death. Presiding over that monument is Victory, Jewel of the Soul by Rudolph Thiem. He's an image that has been embraced by the city of Hamilton. In the upper left, you'll see an image of the memorial itself and Victory watching over the city. Inside, there's depiction on the walls of the names of everyone who fought for the Union. White soldiers on the main floor, and one floor up, a listing of colored troops from Butler County. The memorial also remembers women at the home front and also serving as caring for the wounded on the battlefield. Greenwood Cemetery in Hamilton, Ohio, is the burial place of General Vanderveer, the highest ranking officer from Butler County, who, after the war, had been instrumental in the creation of the Civil War national parks, and also the burial site of Major George Rue, who actually captured John Hunt Morgan, who fought in the 9th Cavalry from Kentucky on the U.S. Army, for the U.S. Army. Also, the gravesite of Colonel John Minor Milliken, memorialized by Dr. Swing, by David Swing at Miami. 1st Ohio Cavalry, died at Stones River. Here's his tombstone, still receiving memorial flowers. And here's a picture of him in his cavalry outfit. The Oxford Cemetery is where the remains of Robert McFarland rest, with his footstone showing that he was a colonel in the 86 OVI. Barrows, the painter, is also, who became a wartime illustrator, is buried here, as is Alfred Weston, who was in the band of the 59th OVI, and Richard Willis DeWitt of the 47th Ohio Infantry, who won a Medal of Honor at Gettysburg, or received a Medal of Honor for his service at Vicksburg. And up in the upper right-hand corner, a sentimental stone, the son, who is not named, the son of N. and E. Brooks, who died at Vicksburg, Mississippi in 1861 in the service of his country, 26 years, 2 months, and 6 days of age. The Minor Milliken Post of the Grand Army of the Republic, a group of Union veterans who formed after the Civil War, placed a memorial cannon in the East Park at Oxford. Today, it's Martin Luther King Jr. Park, but that cannon still stands as a vigil to those who died fighting for the Union and the end of slavery in the Civil War. So Abraham Lincoln said, "The mystic cords of memory stretching from every battlefield and patriot grave to every living heart and hearthstone all over this broad land will yet swell the chorus of the Union when again touched, as surely they will be, by the better angels of our nature." I thank you for this excursion into a Civil War experience in Oxford, Ohio. And we'll move now to questions or comments.
All right. Thank you so much, Curt. We really appreciate walking us through that. As he mentioned, we are open for questions right now. And I know we're getting close to 1 o'clock if you're planning on an hour for this, and you still want to have your question answered, we will go a little over, and the recording will be available later today if you'd like to see that. All right, one thing before I forget, since we have Miamians that like history on this call, I want to put a plug in for Love and Honor Weekend, which is happening next month in Atlanta. And it includes a tour of the Atlanta History Center, which has one of only 2 Civil War cycloramas in it, and it depicts the Battle of Atlanta, which you mentioned, and is really a cool thing there. And so if you are interested and able to go to Atlanta next month, we'd love to have you. That's Love and Honor Weekend on the alumni website. And let's start with, I think I just have one correction for you, Curt. Someone mentioned that the fraternity you said was Alpha Delta Phi. So Alpha Delta Phi, so we'll get that one. And then we have a few questions already, and please bring more in. But Rick wanted to know, he said, sorry if I missed this, but did you talk about whether classes went on during the Civil War, and what was the interruption to actual school at Miami?
Yes, the answer to that is classes did go on during the Civil War, and believe it or not, the enrollment gradually increased during the Civil War. So there was the disruption was more about disputes among people who were Union partisans or sympathetic to the idea that the way the war was being prosecuted was overly vigorous, and there should be some sort of negotiated settlement, which would some would hope would end slavery, but others said could not. So there was a lot of dispute and rancor, and as we saw among the faculty, suspicion of the president, suspicion of others. But classes went on, and Miami did not close. It did close after 1873. After the Civil War, it lost student enrollment from southern states, and it had a hard time because it was a fee-driven institution for the most part. And in 1873, the financial panic scared the trustees, and they suspended regular classes for 12 years. But that was well after the war had ended.
Okay, thank you. Rob asked, why did the students protest? I think this is back to the Snowball Rebellion. What were the students protesting when they rolled the snow in?
Well, at the broadest level, you could say they were protesting the sort of authoritarian manner of the president, Mr. McMaster, which was characteristic of that time, but it didn't allow for any kind of hijinks, as Dr. Shriver would say. This was probably started as a good time, but it ended as a struggle, because the president said there's no room for this sort of thing among Miami gentlemen, and you're going to be expelled for putting snow in Old Main. And so they doubled down. But underlying all of that was this question of fraternities. And I apologize for the typo about Alpha Delta Phi. We'll fix that. But yes, the secret fraternities had come to campus, but they were not welcomed. In fact, they were not welcomed, and students wanted more latitude to regulate what they did with their social life outside of class. And so those were the underlying tensions.
Gotcha. Okay, we had a question from Lorna, who asks, why was Oxford seen as a good place for African Americans to live in the 1860s?
Excellent question, and one I have asked also at presentations like this. Well, the educational institutions were willing to hire, and they were places that African Americans could work. Black community was created here well before the Civil War in Oxford, and probably there was some what you might call chain migration of people coming here. That's probably most likely. But the community might have been a little more tolerant of African American activities. Black farmers settled in the township too, so it was opportunity. It was also on one of the Underground Railroad lines, and that might have been a factor. But that's a good question, and I don't think we have a definitive answer.
Okay, good. Well, I think everything else is coming in is mostly thank yous, fabulous presentation, great presentation. Thank you, Dr. Ellison. Sue wants to share this with her classmates. And so this recording will be, she asked how long it'll be available. This recording will be available indefinitely, no set time frame, but the same link where you signed up will have this recording here in the next couple hours. So the registration link on our website for webinars, which again is alumlc.org/MiamiOH. And I talked just enough to get a couple more questions in if you would be willing to answer a few more.
Yeah.
Charles asked for Civil War book recommendations.
Civil War book recommendations.
Yeah.
Well, James Allen McPherson is probably known as the most prominent of traditional historians who write about the Civil War, and he's written many accounts of the war and also reflections on what it meant. And so I commend the work of James Allen McPherson. David Blight has written a book about Frederick Douglass, which is currently quite popular, and I think you should look at that one. If you're interested in the monuments controversy that has been underway, I'll recommend a little book I just completed called Robert E. Lee and Me by Ty Sigilly. And it's about written by the head of the history department at West Point, who grew up in the lost cause myth and has come to understand that that's not the way we should remember the war. And that book is a very compelling account of why that's so. So those are three kinds of recommendations I would make.
Great. And this one's more of a shared story, but Stephen writes, Reverend Junkin and Thomas Jackson are buried within yards of each other at Oak Grove Cemetery, as are their families. His daughter graduated from Washington and Lee, and his wife and sons are Miami alums, and says Lexington, Virginia is a beautiful town and shares Civil War history with the Virginia Military Institute. Definitely worth a visit. That's from Stephen, who also says, thank you, Dr. Ellison.
Thank you, Steve. And Steve is with the McGuffey Museum, and we greatly appreciate the work they do in this community. Yes, I think that in all of those southern communities, and that one in particular, are worth being quite aware of if you want to understand the complexities of the American experience. And the Junkin story, I think, is yet to be fully written.
Yeah. All right. Well, maybe you can do that in your spare time. All right. I think that covers it. Thanks again so much, Dr. Curt Ellison, for your time and sharing this great story. We really appreciate it. Thank you to the viewers for staying connected to Miami and watching along with us. As I said at the beginning, we do have professors lined up the next couple of days at noon, and then Friday is Charter Day, and we are celebrating with Luxembourg cooking demo, the Love and Honor Awards that evening, followed by a bourbon tasting Friday night. So Charter Day, a good day to join us online as well. And with that, I will sign off. Thanks again for the time, and love and honor.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.